Life of the early Northwest Coast Indians. What was the land like? The Northwest Coast region of North America is a land of mist and rain. Few days are really hot or really cold. Most days, however, are wet. Trees grew tall and forests are lush with moss. From almost everywhere, you can hear the sounds of rushing water. This native people who settled here at least 8,000 years ago formed many tribes. Before these people met the Europeans, they had a very unique way of life. They lived completely off the natural resources around them to help them meet their needs and wants. Read on to find out what life was like for these early Northwest Coast Indians. What did they eat? Native Americans of the Northwest Coast didn't farm, they didn't have to. The forests were full of nuts, berries, and animals to hunt. The rivers were full of salmon, their main food, and other fish. People got food from the ocean as well. They caught big fish, such as halibut. They even hunted walruses, seals, and whales. To cook, the Indians smoked the salmon over the fires, roasted food over an open fire, or cooked in a large pit dug in the ground that worked just like an oven. What were their houses like? Many people think that all Indians lived in teepees made from animal skin, but this is not true. The Northwest Coast Indians did not live in teepees because the climate was so wet. The animal skin teepees would not have kept them dry in the heavy rain. So, what did they live in? Trees were plentiful, and the early Northwest Coast Indians did not have to move around a lot to follow animals. So they built houses made of cedar wood. One house might be as big as 80 feet long and 50 feet wide, and it only had one very large room. Each house had several levels of sleeping stalls along the walls. In the middle of the room was a fire pit, and there was a hole in the roof to let out smoke. All the people in the house belonged to the same clan. This means they shared ancestors. Can you imagine trying to sleep with 50 or 60 of your closest family members all sleeping in the same room? What did they wear? The Indians of the Pacific Northwest even made clothing out of cedar trees. Not the hard bark on the outside of the trunk, but the soft, thin bark underneath. They didn't need much to stay warm, but they did need to stay dry. Early Northwest Coast Indians wove capes and skirts from cedar bark that were water repellent. They also made cone-shaped hats that worked like umbrellas. How did they travel? There were no roads and no cars, planes or trains at the time of the early Northwest Coast Indians, but they did have many waterways in the area. The Indians built large and long canoes from cedar trees to travel these waterways. Some canoes were up to 50 feet long and 8 feet wide. Each canoe could hold between 2 and 50 people and 10,000 pounds of cargo, such as fish, at one time. They also had smaller boats for single families or shorter day outings. What kind of work did they do? Every member of the Northwest Coast community had jobs to do. Northwest Coast Indians' children were taught early on about these roles they would take on as adults, usually by observing their parents. On a typical day, a girl, for example, would learn about collecting berries and weaving cedar bark mats by watching and helping her mother. Boys as young as 6 started fishing, hunting, and hunting with their father. During the winter months, they might help the men carve items such as tools and small canoes. Elders, older people, would also teach girls and boys about the family history and how to behave by telling the tribe's old stories. Family was very important to the early Northwest Coast Indians.